Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Now there's a massive update that I have to cover, so hang in there for the entirety of this video. Because there is a lot to cover and there are significant advances by the Russians in a lot of different areas. Starting out in the south, the Russians have advanced further within Antonivka, gaining a foothold and advancing within the first few streets of the settlement. At the same time, they've passed through to gain control over the central parts of Krasnikivka. Further north, the Russians have advanced further along the distance of Kurakhove from Maximilianivka, attacking the fortified positions of Kurakhove, and thereby the Battle of Kurakhove begins on the 22nd of October 2024. So we'll see how long it takes for the Russians to gain control over that settlement compared to other fortified positions such as Avdiivka, Marinka, and Volodar. Further north in the direction of Selidovo, the Russians are advancing further within the central parts of the settlement, capturing the garage areas in the northeastern parts and moving along the first few roads in the northern parts of Selidovo. At the same time, the Russians have started fighting over the dacha area and the residential buildings north of Selidovo, where the main focus seems to be on the northern bank of the river line, where the Russians are attacking both in the direction of the high-rise apartment complex buildings and through the eastern parts. Further north in the direction of Sherebinivka, the Russians have started advancing in the direction of that settlement, following the capture of the river line here in between Leonidivka and Nelipivka, and with continuous fighting over the northwestern parts, the Russians are able to continue advancing. In the direction of Joseph Yar, there is a significant advance by the Russians. They've managed to capture the northeastern micro-district on the western bank of the canal, aligned with Kalinina. They've also managed to capture the entire eastern district of Joseph Yar, reaching the central parts of the city. There are still Ukrainian positions here and there in pockets of resistance within the area they recently captured. That is due to the basements not being cleared, so the Russians are clearing this area as they continue advancing, but they've managed to reach the central parts of the settlement, and this entire area is now under Russian control somewhat. And that is the second Joseph Yar breakthrough this month. At this rate, the Russians may gain full control over Joseph Yar in a month's time. This will allow for a significant advantage to be gained for the Russians in the continuing battles over the Donetsk region. Further north, the Russians have managed to capture the settlement of Novosadovo, gaining full control of it and the surrounding areas, capturing 10 square kilometers along the northern parts and eastern parts of the Serpis River line, as Russians continue offensive operations along the Serpis River line in a southern direction and towards Torske from the east, so a combined assault from both sides. Further north, the Russians have also managed to gain a significant advantage here west of Selmahivka, capturing significant portions of the fields and forest lines here west of Selmahivka, pushing all the way towards Losova, fighting over the first fortified positions of the Ukrainians, and gaining control over the majority of the Luhansk Oblast here in the northern parts. If we take a look at the Luhansk Oblast, there only remains these three parts remaining under Ukrainian control, so the Russians control about 99.5% of the Luhansk territory, with this final parts being under Ukrainian control. Finally, in the Kursk region, the Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade continues counterattacks here in the direction of Novoivanovka, Zeleny Shlях, Leonidovo, and Alexandria, where there is heavy fighting. The Ukrainians launch assault after assault, and the Russians try to hold their positions and launch counterattacks constantly. So there's a lot of heavy battles taking place over these four settlements, which has left the area in a gray zone, as neither side can hold full control over them. So heavy fighting continues in this direction, and then there's a lot of combat footage covering the Ukrainian attempts at counterattacking here in the direction of Novoivanovka and Zeleny. There's this convoy here showing the movement of Ukrainian troops, which was geolocated here to the southeast of the settlement, from which we have this combat footage of the Ukrainians driving into the southern parts of Zeleny, where they are sending infantry, dropping them off from the armored personnel carriers and the tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, providing cover. The soldiers take positions in the side of the road, and then they move up towards the settlement. So we see that there is attempts by the Ukrainians to recapture these positions and prevent a Russian encirclement of the Ukrainian positions here by Kruklenkoe and the several settlements here in the north, which have already been partially encircled with the Russian capture of Novaya Soroshina. but it could have ended much worse if the Russians gained control of Malaya Luknia and captured to gain control the southern flank here. The 47th Mechanized Brigade is the one conducting these counteroffensive operations to regain control over these settlements, following the Russian counteroffensive to push the Ukrainians out of the Kursk region. In the Oskil River line direction, the Russians have now gained full control over the northern parts of the Serbis River line and have made significant advances on the western side of the river line, fully securing the river line and the central parts and pushing all the way to the outskirts of Losova. There are multiple objectives with the Russians here. There's the northern direction, which is to close off the gap in between Pishane and Stelmahivka. This will allow for secure supplies going to and from Krohlyakivka. And with the Russian control already over the majority of the settlement, this objective operation is to gain control over a lot of supply lines so they can send additional forces both to the northern and southern directions. The second objective is to gain control over Losova and move along the fortified positions here in the south, which would become a bottleneck as Russians advance further south along the Uska River line. And the third objective is to move down south from Vishneve towards Trefneve and launch offensive operations in the direction of Borova from the east as well, securing the western bank of Serbis River line near Nadia and the settlements here along the Luhansk-Kharkiv border. From this, we see that these advances are very significant, capturing several fields and forest lines totaling up to more than 35 square kilometers. The Russians are now on the outskirts of Losova, have nearly captured the settlement of Vishneve, and are moving to close the gap between Pishane and Selmahivka, which will strengthen the Russian offensive operations here in the eastern bank of the Uska River line. Again, the most significant part of all of this is that the Russians are conducting several offensive operations all across the Donetsk and Luhansk front lines. Further south, the Russians, with the capture of Novosadova, are now closer to Cherny and the general direction of Torske, where offensive operations are here looking to cut off the Ukrainian positions here east of the Serbis River line in Cherny and Yampolivka from the remaining settlements. This is why the Russians are moving further north over the fighting in Torske to spread out the Ukrainian forces and attempt to cut off the southern bank of Yampolivka by hitting the supply road here in the southern direction. And with the fighting here in the northern direction by Novosadova, the Russians are advancing towards Cherny, which is being heavily bombarded by FAB bombs, so the Russians will likely look to gain quick control over both Cherny and Yampolivka with heavy firepower and storming these positions to gain control of the northern parts, which will then allow to enter Torske from the north. Combined with assaults from the east, the Russians would look to gain control over that settlement as well, gaining control over the Serbis River line entirely, and moving to flank the Ukrainian positions in the Serebryanki forest area here to the south of Kreminna. In the direction of Jazov Yar, the Russians have gained full control over the eastern district of Jazov Yar. There is this bottleneck in the defenses of the Ukrainians, which would prevent a large assault by the Russians through the residential area. As it is a small area, the Ukrainians can concentrate their forces to prevent a breakthrough and heavily bombard the Russian positions just across. However, the Russians have also managed to make significant advances along the railways, which spreads out the front line a bit more. There's also the possibility of the Russians advancing the northern parts towards the northern district of Jazov Yar and from the southern direction to enter Jazov Yar from the south. Expanding the front line to this point has allowed the Russians to significantly improve their positions. They'll also likely advance from the forest patches here to the south of Jazov Yar and advance in northern direction towards Hryhorivka, securing the positions further. And with this wide a front line, they can attack from every single direction, north, east, south. And this allows the Russians to have a very strong positions in the direction of Jazov Yar. The Ukrainian defensive capabilities in the city has significantly diminished over the past few months of heavy fighting near the city and heavy bombardment of it. In the New York direction, the Russians are now getting close to Sherbinivka. There are reports that they've already reached the outskirts of it and the fighting has reached the settlement. With this, the Russians continue offensive operations in the western flank of Toretsk, while heavy fighting continues within the city itself. So you see yet again, the fighting is taking place here by Stelmahivka in the north, by Liman in the south of the Luhansk region, in the direction of Jazov Yar by Bakhmut, in the direction of New York and Toretsk, There's also the continuation of the offensive operations direction of Selidovo, which is connected to the Pokrov section of the front line, and heavy fighting by Kurakhove here in the south. And there's also the continuing operations near Volodar. There's been the fighting near Velika Novoselka, which seems it could have simply been a distraction, redirecting Ukrainian forces from the east to the south of the Donetsk region. But it could also be that the operations will continue depending on how the Ukrainians react and so on. But we see that the Russians are really attacking on the entire eastern section of the front line, excluding Zaporizhia. There are talks of a upcoming Russian Zaporizhia offensive, and if the Russians successfully recapture Kursk as well, it is simply fighting on the entire section of the front line, and the Ukrainian lines are continuously diminishing in strength and nearing collapse. And to the ones who didn't believe the Russians will not collapse the Ukrainian lines, you're simply exaggerating, clickbaiting, and so on. Compare the fact that the Russians have captured about 70 square kilometers in a single day in a span of 24 hours in the Donetsk and Luhansk and Kharkiv regions here in the east, with no new front being opened, no significant maneuver warfare. The Russians have simply rotated their forces, sent in fresh units that has allowed for offensive operations to be pulled off on a large scale, and they are now overwhelming the Ukrainian defenses. If they break the Ukrainian lines in just one point, it will be devastating for the Ukrainians. If they do it at several points across the front line, then the Ukrainian lines could completely collapse. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.